The first of these 9 major principles of classical education is the principle of the seed, what the ancients called sperma. At mathematics, the seed was the original form or figure to which a second figure, called the gnomon, is added, reproducing the shape of the original. The process, repeated again and again, forms a tessellated mosaic that covers a plane. The gnomon increases in size geometrically, while maintaining the dimensions of the original seed. From the root of the word, gnomon, we get such words as gnome and ignominy, as well as other related words such as knowledge and to know something. The mathematical tessellation from seed to mosaic was symbolic of the development of the soul, encouraged through education. This isn't some platitude or some piece of wallpaper. It really involves a very complex series of ideas.
The first is that gnomon, the seed in the ground, is traced back to the agrarian nature of the ancient world. The ancient world was an agrarian culture, farmers and the like, and intimately knowledgeable about the planting of seeds and the change of seasons and the time to harvest and life in general, because they're very much in touch with life. But that's not the only reason. Perhaps this idea did stem originally from an agrarian root, no pun intended. The idea, though, is connected rather to a question about life itself. We talk about how education is the planting of a seed that grows later into something. It's like the planting of an idea in someone's head, or soul, or heart. The earth is the analog, the parallel, the metaphor for the human heart, for the human soul, for the human mind. And when we plant the seed, we plant the idea that later will take fruit, will take root in their life and become something that bears great fruit, comes to fruition. This is also known as an inception, a planting of an idea when someone is young that only later becomes fully what it's supposed to be. All education then was about this planting of the gnomon, planting of the idea. But in Greek, idea, eidos, means form, the very form of a thing. So when we go to create an education of someone, we're actually planting in their mind the form, which is the greatest image or greatest manifestation, if you will, of realities or truths that as human beings we deal with. Not to get too far ahead of ourselves, because we'll deal with the great chain of being further on in a later edition. But essentially, the very mind of the Creator had in it this pattern or blueprint called the Logos, and the Logos had these major images, major forms that everything was based upon. Those forms, eidoi, ideas, were what the human soul was trying to get to, trying to master, trying to become one with. So when we plant the seed, we're planting the small form, gnomon, of the later great form, the eidos. We're planting just as the planter does, we're planting the seed in the ground that will later become the great harvest, the great yield. Or, you could say, we're planting the idea that later becomes the great tree that bears fruit. The parable, for instance, in the Bible of the mustard seed that grows into the tree is very apt. It's hearkening back to this idea, this image. The ancient world was so concerned with this idea, this basis for education as outlined here in the Gnomon, that there's a whole cult devoted to it. Now, cult doesn't mean something bad in this case. Cult is cultus. It's like agriculture, for instance, or cultivating the land. It is, again, a farming image where the teacher is like a farmer and the religious person is like a farmer, the priest or priestess being like a farmer, in that they helped prepare the individual souls to receive that seed, that word, that image that later becomes the eidos, the idea of the good and the true and the beautiful. So the whole process of not just of education, but of religion and of life itself was to move from a barren field soul to be a fertile field soul that then receives the gnomon, the seed, that then grows into the eidoi, the idea, and then ultimately into the logos itself. The cult that was primarily devoted to this was a cult that was based in the city of Eleusis. And what are called the Eleusinian mysteries were a major cult in the ancient world. Normally, people that were inducted into those mysteries were called initiates. And those initiates would then be allowed to have access to certain rituals that people that were not initiates did not have access to. And those rituals, both public and private, had a dual meaning. They had the meaning that was the obvious outside meaning that the world would see, and then those had an interior meaning that only the initiates had access to. And then there were also ceremonies that were completely private. So if an initiate revealed those ceremonies, the punishment was quite severe. They took these things very seriously, see. In fact, they were so severe that you could suffer death for revealing those mysteries. Plato and Aristotle were initiates, as were Euripides and Sophocles and many of the other great thinkers and writers and artists of the Golden Age of Athens. This cult, the Eleusinian cult, was devoted to the goddess Ceres, or Demeter in Roman. Ceres, the word we get cereal, as in Cheerios or Rice Krispies or what have you, we get that word from this because Ceres was the goddess of the grain, and those are grain foods. So Ceres, or Demeter, was the goddess not just of grain itself, but of the perpetuation of grain, the perpetuation, therefore, also of life. Because what the Eleusinian mystery really was addressing, the question it was addressing, was what is life? Why does life keep returning? Here in Minnesota, we certainly understand this. When we have a long, long winter, everything seems dead. It's like you're in the tomb for months on end. And then finally, when the sun begins to rise in its zenith, then we see things sprout out of the ground and life comes back and we have greenery around us. And then things die off and we go back into winter again. And this cycle continues and continues and continues. And it has continued in pretty much the same pattern for the entire time human beings have been on this planet. Therefore, that pattern seems to be something which is almost like something eternal. It is an eternal pattern.
The primary eternal pattern is one of life, death, and rebirth. Tapping into this pattern seems to have been the essence of religious experience for most of human history. It also seems to be the essence of education, which itself feeds into and participates in religious experience. And the Eleusinian cults devoted to Ceres were where this was most readily practiced. The cult not only celebrated the feeding of humanity with cereal grain, and thus were referred to as cereal cults, but the idea also of balance, proportion, and order, what the Romans called ratio, and the Greeks called analog, analogia, rational thought or reason. The very thing that distinguishes humans from animals, reason, was part of the cult of Ceres in the Eleusinian mysteries.
Because there's a balance between life and death. There's a balance between winter and between summer and fall and spring. Everything has its season. To everything there's a season. Turn and turn and turn. And the world continues in this perpetual, eternal cycle. The whole story then of Ceres and her daughter, Kore, or Persephone as she's called, going into the underworld, plays into this. And then later, the story of Dionysus, the god of wine from the east, plays into this as well. And those cults of Ceres and Dionysus merge eventually into a single cult of bread and of wine. But they're still celebrating the same thing. And what they're celebrating is that as human beings, we are part of this process. Just as the eternal process follows a pattern set down in the Edoi, so too does the temporal process of each individual person follow that pattern. And as we'll deal with in a later installment, as above, so below. Things in this world follow that pattern in heaven, for lack of a better word. And in order to understand what we're going through, we have to concentrate, focus, meditate upon those great things, those great Edoi, those great patterns that are above. This is the principle of the Gnomon, of the seed. Everything begins in that single seed that is wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid in a manger of your heart or mind or soul, that later on will grow into the great tree on which life itself will be hung.